marks the 150th celebration of the birth of William Butler Yeats, a poet whose words are woven into the fabric of our national consciousness. From the beauty of his early lyrical verse and his enduring love for Maud Gonne, through the work of his middle years that both questions and celebrates the fledgling Irish state, to his meditations on ageing, art and mortality, Yeats's poetry offers us an insight into a life fully lived. Here to reflect on the life, work and legacy of W.B. Yeats, we're joined by three of Ireland's most celebrated poets, the current Irish Chair of Poetry, Paula Meehan, and Michael Longley and Harry Clifton, who have both previously held that Chair of Poetry post. Welcome one and all. Yeats, I suppose, a poet and a figure that many people will know, or at least they'll think of songs like and poems like Down by the Sally Garden, or they'll think of whatever particular poem they did for their leaving cert or at school, be it Easter 1916 or No Second Try, Sailing to Byzantium. Those poems will all spring to mind. But I want from each one of you to get personally what Yeats means to you and what that initial memory of Yeats is. Paula Meehan, first of all.
Well, my first encounter with him goes back to primary school. Miss Shannon in the Central Model Girls' School in Dublin, you know, beating out the meter with her stick. That, I think that's before you really understand what the poetry means in any narrow way, but the mesmeric quality of it and the fact that you would end up kind of rocking into this place where there were images and pictures. So that's my first encounter with him, specifically in a poem called The Cat in the Moon, which Miss Shannon thought was suitable for children, you know.
He means something very different now, I guess.
Yeah, well, as you grow older and you develop a relationship with specific poems, you realise now that The Cat in the Moon was actually written when he was it was written when he was in his 50s, and in fact it's a hymn to the interconnectedness of everything. The cat in his animal blood being stirred by the moon. We all are connected together.
Michael Longley, you're certainly an early part of your connection with Yeats comes from a request you made at a prize-winning ceremony as a very young boy.
When I was in the third form at my school, I chose the collected poems of W.B. Yeats, or W.B. Yeats as I called him then, and that rather alarmed my parents when I brought back this. I remember the book vividly, physically, you know, the maroon boards and a cream-coloured dust jacket. And I think I liked, you know, the songs and the ballads at that stage. But I see now that Yeats is almost the perfect example of how poetry concerns itself with everything that happens to everybody. And he's a glorious companion as one proceeds through life. And I find that, I don't want to say that he gets better, but you know what I mean? He means more and more to me as I get older. He's the poet who, to use an awful phrase, ticks all the boxes.
What are those boxes?
The problems of falling in love, the problem of political disappointment, the fear of death, growing old, the wonders of the world, all of those. I don't know what other boxes there are.
That's about them, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
What about yourself then, Harry Clifton? Where did it start and where has it moved to for you?
Well, I think when you're young, you usually are some kind of nature mystic. And I think that the early Yeats, which came to me in school, appealed to the nature mystic in me and to the person who spent time in the west of Ireland.
When you say school, are we talking secondary school?
Secondary school, yeah. And particularly a poem like The Song of Wandering Angus, with those wonderful transformations. Somebody called me by my name, it had become a glimmering girl, etc., etc. Very, very heavily emotional. On the other hand, I very quickly moved away from the early Yeats because, if you're trying as a young poet to find your own voice, Yeats is a very beautiful poet, but he's not necessarily a very useful poet in terms of getting to the kind of rougher music maybe of your own time, and in my case an urban time. The early Yeats is very rural, mystical, so although I loved it for its beauty, I found I moved away from it quickly because it lacked that closeness of a model that you need.
All right, well, let us not move away from the early lyrical stuff too quickly. And since you mentioned the song of Wandering Angus there from the collection The Wind Among the Reeds, published in 1899, we have a reading of that, and the reader here is Bosco Hogan.
I went out to the hazel wood because a fire was in my head, and cut and peeled a hazel wand and hooked a berry to a thread. And when white moths were on the wing and moth-like stars were flickering out, I dropped the berry in a stream and caught a little silver trout. When I had laid it on the floor, I went to blow the fire aflame, but something rustled on the floor, and someone called me by my name. It had become a glimmering girl with apple blossom in her hair, who called me by my name and ran and faded through the brightening air. Though I am old with wandering through hollow lands and hilly lands, I will find out where she has gone, and kiss her lips and take her hands, and walk among long dappled grass, and pluck till time and times are done the silver apples of the moon, the golden apples of the sun.
The song of Wandering Angus there from The Wind Among the Reeds, William Butler Yeats' collection and poem, and the reader was Bosco Hogan. Listening to Bosco Hogan almost perform that piece of poetry. I know poetry is a spoken art form in many ways anyway, but those early lyrics and those early poems in particular, do we get much more from reciting them aloud, Michael Longley?
Well, I think poetry is launched from the mouth and finds its resting place in the ear. And it's worthwhile remembering that poetry preceded alphabets by thousands of years, and we're meant to say it aloud. I myself think that all a poem requires is to be voiced. I think one just opens one's mouth and lets the words come out.
Is there something specific in Yeats, Harry, that's different from other poets in that respect, or is he just a good example of a poem or a poet whose work should be spoken?
Well, I think a lot of the early Yeats was actually performed accompanied by a musical instrument. And I think the musicality of that early work was quite deliberate in many ways. And the further on you go in Yeats, in a certain sense, the more he roughens and toughens up his music and sort of brings it closer to the spoken voice and away from that pure musicality.
But whether it's the early Yeats that you're differentiating very well from the later Yeats, he seems from the word go to me to have what musicians would call perfect pitch.
There is the famous recording of Yeats intoning the Lake Isle of Innisfree. I'm not sure whether that does him justice or not, Paula Meehan, but I suppose what both Harry and Michael are talking about there, it links into Yeats' love of theatre and how he uses poetry almost as a gesture in theatre.
Yeah, well, the magic elements of it were crucial for him, and ideas around the mask and putting on a mask through which to speak. And if you think that the word itself, persona, it means through sound, persona, to come through sound. So he had a very strong sense of putting on the masks through which to speak and amplify his passions. But he was also totally devoted to learning magic as well as his trade. In fact, it's hard to separate when he says Irish poets learn your trade later on. You have to ask, well, which exact trade was he talking about? Because the magic augmented his idea of the line as the spell, as the made thing that affected change. So his, often, certainly when I studied Yeats, the magic elements, his use of tarot and astrology were totally sidelined. It was kind of filed under Silly Willy. In fact, the more I go read back into him now in this year, I see how central it was when the Fenian leader John O'Leary wrote to him and said, listen, give up all that old nonsense and come and help us build a nation. He absolutely said no. The magic is at the heart of everything I do. And I believe coded into his lines, and why we can still go back to him 100 years after his birth is because of this ritualising of sound into powerful forces.
Was there anything there, even in the early years, in Yeats's young life, that hints at that direction towards magic and that direction towards mysticism, Harry?
In a sense, there was an absence in his life, which I think probably, or partly at least, moved him in that direction. We often think of Yeats as, somehow buried in the past and swallowed up in romanticism, but he's very modern in one way, which is that he was a self-made man. And he uses the term myself I must remake, in one of his later poems. But I think that Yeats was left in a bit of a void by the sheer power of his father's scepticism about everything spiritual apart from art. And I think that he had to make his soul, very, very deliberately from very early on. He had to work his way into spiritual life in a way that most of us don't, who are presented with a space that we walk into. We may not be happy in it, but we walk into it. I think Yeats was left with a spiritual void by his wonderful father, who was also, I think, terribly against religion, and left him in something of a void.
I think too, he felt that he'd been robbed of belief by Darwin and Huxley. And in a way, he constructs his own religion out of poetry, and I love the fact that he and Maud Gonne had plans to form an order of Celtic mysteries on an island somewhere. I don't think it ever got off the ground, and you can't help wondering who would have done the washing up. But he was a wonderful self-creator and one-man band with such persuasive powers that he brought others along with him.